Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. Australia's pandemic lockdowns, which stretched late into 2021 as the public sought to get vaccinated, resulted in carnage for the business community. A contraction in economic growth, but also very healthy gains for share market and property investors. So what looms now on the new year's horizon? And was the Reserve Bank right in promising not to lift interest rates until 2024? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. Like many of his peers, Melbourne University economics professor Neville Norman is predicting rapid economic growth in the new year, coming off 2020's poor performance. But he differs with some by forecasting that the Reserve Bank will have to move soon to increase interest rates in a time of rising inflation. If it moves too late, Professor Norman says that the bank risks a real estate and share market slump. Neville Norman starts by explaining to Jeff Waters why it is that businesses should always have their eyes on the economic road ahead.
Looking ahead, even if it's just a calendar year, and many businesses look longer, is so important, and that's why we do it. And please don't just think about this as econo talk about GDP. What happens to the economy affects almost every business. And long ago, I tried to group the sort of things you could look at of all the hundreds of variables in economics into GIRP, G-I-R-P. Now that stands for economic growth, inflation, rates of interest and exchange, and public economic policy, of course, inflicted on us by governments. And this is the crunch. If we get strong growth, as almost certainly we all think we'll get in 2022, rebounding out of the sluggish 2021 with more damage from COVID than many people saw at the start of the year, then there'll be pressure on inflation, not just of consumer prices, but shares and houses as we've already seen, and that leads on to the potential risk of higher interest rates, exchange rate movements, probably down, and that's then the response that impacts on all of us when it changes taxes, budgets, monetary policy, and of course the profits in your business.
Let's start with growth and inflation. How can the Reserve Bank ignore the supply-side issues that we're seeing at the moment?
Well, let's do the numbers first, but you've hit the right question on that one. The official Business Essentials number for GDP growth in calendar 2022 over 2021 is 5.5%. It'll be the highest we've had for a long time, but it's coming out of the hole. But at BE, we always do some twists. That's the new word for things that can happen to get us off course, particularly if you're smart enough not to just take one view of the future. If COVID disappears sooner and more thoroughly, and that mainly means the restrictions, then 6.8%, or if it snaps back and we get more closures and restrictions, which bedeviled the budget last year, then 3.5. And inflation, there's not much that can take it off its course, Jeff, of about just over 3%. I've got a number of 3.2, and I won't move that much if the COVID changes or even if the election goes to a change of government. But what could change it is the action of the Reserve Bank.
Tell us more about your view on those interest rates and exchange rates.
If you want single numbers, and I'm not against it, you should have a MOLO, a most likely outcome. What I'm against, with a career-long objection to it, is stopping there and looking at what else can happen. And nothing is more precarious, Jeff, than single numbers about inflation and interest rates and exchange rates. I'll give you the single numbers. 7.5% further rise in share prices, 3.2% inflation has given 76 cents US to the Australian dollar, all on the average through calendar 2022 and probably at the end. Now, they can be changed if the Reserve Bank either A, stays rigid to its ill-advised promise of no rate rises until 2024, or B, moves slowly upwards, which would be a great outcome, don't want to inflict it on anyone, or panics and leaves it late and then surges up. You can kiss goodbye the property and share market boom, and that's why it's so important. And so going on to my house price forecasts, 6% growth Sydney, 3.5% in median houses and flats growth, but could be 11% Sydney, 8% Melbourne if they let it run. But if the bank panics, then name any negative you want.
Economic policy?
Well, economic policy is monetary and budgetary policy. We've pretty well done those, but I give you two striking predictions for 2022. Number one, unlike 2019, the last election year, a very good chance that they'll dump the budget to later in the year, so it won't be delivered by the current government. It will either be a new government or a return of the current government. That's the first striking prediction. And the second one, very striking, is that whoever wins, it will make very little difference to the main structure of the budget. Now, it's highly controversial. I see differences in the environmental area and a few social policy areas, but the ALP, this is the very, very significant point, has learnt from 2019 not to muck with taxes. They made a pig's breakfast of it and probably cost them the election. So, Jeff, a change in government in 2022 is a serious possibility, but reassuringly, the ALP, if it's learnt from its anti-business backfired policies, there won't be much of a different tax policy for 2022.
Neville, can you crisply summarise your outlook for the economy in 2022?
Well, this will be crisp and it'll be cannon gun, so replay it. It won't all be good news. Strong growth for 2022 at 5.5%, with a point or two up or down depending on COVID. That's the big thing. And towards the end of the year, slower with interest rate increases, which is my mainline prediction. Inflation stuck around 3% of consumer prices, but where we go with share prices and property prices depends on whether we have a sensible or a silly Reserve Bank. We've had a silly Reserve Bank so far, but it hasn't mattered because they've kept the rates where it is. A sensible Reserve Bank will raise the interest rates slowly, and that will cool but not kill the share market and the property markets. I wouldn't be surprised to see 5 to 8% off both of those, and that would be a good result in the circumstances. The next federal election, most likely to be in May, can't be any later. They'll avoid Easter in April, and a significant chance of a change of government, but it's, as we look at it now, 50-50, and for business it doesn't matter. My last prediction is about Omicron, and that is, if you know your Greek, we might get Kappa, Lambda and Omega, but it's not going to matter for business because with vaccinations is the biggest point. I don't see, and this time I agree with the government of last year, they were wrong for last year, any significant change in the economic policy affecting you in business. Let's finish on twisters. Twisters are the things that can change that outlook. There's three: the election, COVID and the bank. The election, as stated, is probably not going to change much for the reasons I've given. COVID is not going to change much because even if we get new variants, Kappa and Lambda or whatever, with vaccination, I doubt we're going to go on to the restrictions that have mucked up so much of business in front of you. That's good news. But the bank, despite no rate rises until 2024, I advise a near certainty that they will move rates up in 2022. I've banged on to this for some time, preferably sooner and less, much better than a delayed economy-wrecking sharp rise. Terry McCrann says they're too silly to get that right. I don't think the bank will be so silly. They're already distancing themselves from that ill-advised promise of no rate rises till 2024. Faith, hope and love. The greatest of all is love. But for 2022, election, COVID and the bank are the biggest risk twisters for business. And the bank is the biggest of them all. If it doesn't twist in 2022, hopefully small, then we've got some problems. I believe they will, and I believe it'll be the best possible outcome we can have. That's our vision for 2022. 2022.
That was Melbourne University Professor of Economics, Neville Norman. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.